Welcome to Defense Priorities video series reviewing the newly released National Defense Strategy. I'm Jennifer Kavanagh, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, and I'll be breaking down the NDS with leading defense and foreign policy experts. We'll discuss what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and what it means for restraint and U.S. grand strategy. In this episode, I'm joined by Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And we're going to be talking about what the NDS says about burden shifting. Justin, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
So first question, the National Defense Strategy lays out the importance of burden shifting. It has a whole section on it and then talks about it in each individual section, the importance of allies and partners taking on more of the responsibility of their own defense. What can you tell us about what's new here? How is this different than past administrations' approaches to dealing with allies and partners?
Well, I mean, complaining about burden sharing is a storied American tradition and has had very little impact on policy historically. What this document does differently is it has the sort of 4 bullet points, the highlights, if you will, of defense policy, as highlighted by the Pentagon. So it's Western Hemisphere and territorial defense, competing with China. Burden shifting is the 3rd bullet point, and the 4th bullet point is sort of revitalizing the defense industrial base. What I think is notable here, and I'm sort of on record saying that these sorts of strategy documents rarely constrain willful presidents, and this president is a particularly willful president. It's in keeping with his decades-long complaining about burden shifting. I was just revisiting a couple things he did in 1987 and 1988. The president took in 1987, he took out an ad in the New York Times complaining in this case about Japan and Saudi Arabia and saying that, the United States in the Persian Gulf protects ships that aren't its own, carrying oil it doesn't need by allies that won't pitch in. So it's this theme in the document is very consonant with the president's longstanding beliefs about sort of being taken for a ride or played for a sucker by our allies. And so I think it's good in that sense, in the sense that it is, it sort of reflects the chief executive's view of burden shifting. However, and we're probably about to get into this, I think that getting something done is going to be harder than just highlighting it in the document.
So, I think we might agree here that the administration is sending some mixed messages, even though, the message here about burden shifting is pretty clear. We haven't seen any major changes in U.S. force posture. Still have about the same number of troops in Europe. We might even have more in the Middle East, maybe the same in Asia. So is the administration serious? Like, should we take the strategy seriously? Or is this just more words?
Right. So that's the right question to ask, and I don't have a great answer. I think the administration is serious, and the question is whether one wants to credit its theory of the case. I don't see any substantial troop withdrawals from Europe in the foreseeable future. So from my sort of simple-minded way of thinking, that suggests that they're not wanting to force the issue with the Europeans, right? The argument always went historically, if we pull out and do less and have less presence, they will generate more military power to replace that provided by our presence. And so if you say, well, if we're not pulling any troops out, then how are we going to burden shift? I think that's basically a fair argument. And that's the question that I've had. I was in Brussels last April, and the people at NATO were talking very airily about the sort of planning goals and the capabilities targets for different member states, and that this was going to make clear to these states that they needed to step up. And I think the administration basically believes the same thing, that in doctrine, you can sort of say, the commitment that the Americans have at this point is all you're going to get. The cavalry isn't going to come in. And so if you think that 80 or 85,000 or 90,000 people isn't covering the bases enough, then you guys need to step up. And by sort of forcing those capabilities, by making clear that we're not going to add any capabilities to Europe, that's going to be enough to sort of spur a burden shift. And again, I'll leave to others to adjudicate whether or how that might work. And then, as you're quite right, in the Middle East too, right, there has been this, if you think about the Riyadh speech that the president gave, I guess, last May, I think it was, where it was a sort of retro denunciation of neoconservatism, and we're not going to noodle around in countries' domestic politics. We're not trying to remake the region. We're going to face the world as it is. But as we're filming this now, we're sort of dallying with this idea of regime changing Iran, possibly because of something related to its nuclear program, which the administration said was obliterated 6 months ago, or possibly related to the brutal crackdown on protests a couple of weeks ago. So the speechifying and the documents don't always match the policies.
So as restrainers, as people who want to see a smaller military footprint in the world, should we be satisfied with this strategy, or is it lacking something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty hard to satisfy, right? The U.S. foreign policy establishment, and here I'll say the Trump administration also, is having a really hard time taking yes for an answer, right? The historical U.S. interest, to go back to Europe for a second, was keeping European power divided, right? We didn't want Kaiser Wilhelm to have a dominant political, economic, military position in Europe. We sure didn't want Adolf Hitler to have such a position, and we didn't want Joe Stalin to have such a position. The brutal reality that's been demonstrated over the past 4 years now is that Russia is not a candidate to dominate Europe, right? If you can't dominate Ukraine after 4 years of trying, you're not going to do much good taking a swing at Poland, much less France or Germany. So that's just facially true. And we should square up to that. And we should tell the Europeans that we think it's true. And again, my view in the sort of old-fashioned sense is start moving troops out. And not just sort of bring them back onto bases in the United States, but attrit them out of the force, right? If we have 85,000 or 90,000 people in Europe that we don't need to protect American interests in Europe, then the force should be smaller by 85,000 or 90,000 people. And we can talk about folding people into the reserve components or sort of force structure thereafter. But human beings are costly, right? It's the dirty little secret of the Pentagon. Everybody thinks it's $900 toilet seats and the F-35, which is quite expensive, but human beings are really, really expensive. And so we should have fewer of them in an era where the debt to GDP ratio is north of 100%, and we're adding to the debt at a rate of $2 trillion a year. Every agency is going to have to give something. And I think the Defense Department ought to have to give quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really important points. That there's a lot of focus in the national defense strategy on how much allies will spend, right? Like 5% target is becoming sort of the norm. It was first expected of Europe. Now we're looking to allies in Asia and elsewhere to meet this same target. But my argument is always like this just doesn't really matter to me. This isn't a win having them spend more unless the U.S. is also spending less and pulling forces out. So, what do you think is getting in the way? Like, why is there this disconnect between what the administration says it wants, which is burden shifting, and what we see, which is sort of trying to get allies to spend more, but still hanging on to this really large military footprint?
Yeah, I think we're getting bogged down in Europe here, but let's stay where we are, I guess. I think that they have a sort of hot stove sensibility about taking large numbers of troops out. I think they see the writing on the wall, see that the Congress would be absolutely bonkers freaking out. The Europeans would be absolutely bonkers freaking out. And so their theory of the case is that you can push all of this doctrinally via NATO onto the shoulders of the Europeans by signaling, whether that's effective or not is up to anyone's guess, that the United States isn't going to be doing that much lifting if the balloon were to go up in Europe. So I think there are a lot of reasonable questions to ask about why we're supposed to think that would work. But that is their basic theory. And, to generalize from the document, one of the things that, I think that the Hague Summit declaration that the Europeans are going to spend 3.5% and 1.5% on defense-related infrastructure by 2035 is not going to come to fruition for basic strategic and fiscal realities in most of the important countries in Europe. But what that has been used to do is to wag our finger at Asian allies, to a lesser extent, Middle Eastern allies, to say, hey, guess what, South Korea? Hey, guess what, Taiwan? Hey, guess what, Japan? Or that framework that we have for Europe and for NATO applies to you too. And in the case of Taiwan and Japan, I mean, there's been some setbacks, as you pointed out on Twitter, I guess yesterday, with the sort of defense budget in Taipei. But to sort of give a sense that this is the new zeitgeist in Washington, right? That the party's over. And again, whether our allies and partners believe us on this, whether we can make it persuasive to them that the party is in fact over, in a context where the Americans have made a lot of idle threats historically and not followed through on them, is an open question.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me there have to be consequences. If allies aren't stepping up, the U.S. should be withdrawing anyway. We shouldn't be waiting for them. I'm all for transparency and giving allies and partners a clear timeline of what we plan to do and when we plan to do it. But I don't think that timeline should change if allies don't step up. We had the Secretary General of NATO last week say that, if you think that Europe can defend itself without the United States, you're dreaming. I'm like, this is a year into the administration that came in saying you will defend yourself.
Right.
So it seems to me like this message is maybe not catching on. But let's just taking a step back sort of to wrap up our discussion here. Should as restrainers, as people who want to see burden shifting or burden dumping or whatever you want to call it, should we be optimistic or hopeful about this national defense strategy? Does it move us in the right direction or the wrong direction?
I don't think the national defense strategy is going to move us much at all. I wrote an article a couple of years ago with your colleague Ben Friedman saying that we should probably just abolish the NSS and the NDS because they are not strategy documents. And that people got really mad when we wrote that because think tank dorks like us really like these things. We like analyzing them. The people who write them like writing them, but they just don't guide strategy that much, right? Willful presidents do things right, left, and center, even when the strategy document that's supposed to be governing their choices says something completely different. So I don't think that this is going to sort of set us on a path, good, neutral, or indifferent, right? I don't think Donald Trump has read the national security strategy or the national defense strategy, and I don't think he's going to read them. So I think they're limited guides as to predicting what policy will emerge in the future. Their value, to the extent it exists, is people who are close to the president trying to reflect his, in this case, overarching views of international politics and trying to signal to outside parties what to expect. But again, the president prides himself on being unpredictable and making 180-degree turns instantaneously. So I think that's a terribly difficult thing to do.
Yeah, well, let's hope that the unpredictable turn that comes next is a withdrawal of troops from Europe. But anyway, we can at least hope. Anyway, Justin, thanks so much for joining us today. And to everyone else, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to check out the other videos in this series.